At the firing range, the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed across the otherwise silent air. Tommy, a young, eager recruit for the Navy SEALs, stood to the side, carefully watching his target. His breath was shallow, his eyes sharp as he focused, on hitting the bullseye. It was his first time at the range, and everything felt too new, too different. He had just come back from the military base, where the pace was relentless and the stakes high. Today he was here, eager to prove himself as one of the best. But there was something he couldn't quite ignore. The old man. The man with the calm eyes who stood off to the far side of the range, shooting at a slow, measured pace. His hands were steady, his posture relaxed. His gunfire wasn't loud or harsh. It was controlled. Tommy had first noticed him when he walked in. The man's weathered face, the old leather jacket, and the undeniable presence he carried. Yet he stood out in a way that made Tommy's jaw tighten. He couldn't pinpoint why, but there was something about the man that felt out of place, a quiet sense of familiarity, and yet the kind of stillness that unnerved him. Tommy's gaze shifted back to his target, but the curiosity gnawed at him. Who was this man, and what was he doing here? It wasn't until Tommy heard the familiar thudding sound of his instructor's voice that he realized the man wasn't alone. "Hey, excuse me," Tommy said, half turning to the instructor, a gruff guy named Sergeant Daniels. "That guy, he doesn't look like he belongs here. What's his deal?" Sergeant Daniels didn't immediately answer, but his eyes flicked toward the older man. "What do you mean, doesn't belong here?" "Few know him," Tommy said, nodding in the direction of the old man. He's not really the kind of person you see here, you know." There it was. Tommy had said it, and he couldn't take it back. Sergeant Daniels stared for a moment before a slow, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. "I don't know," he said, "but just keep your head in the game. Not everyone's going to be your type of people. You got work to do." Tommy's gaze shifted back to the old man. There was a certain hardness to the man's movements, but it wasn't aggression. It was something more quiet, more lived in, something Tommy didn't quite understand. It wasn't long before the old man's presence caught the attention of the range staff. They kept their eyes on him, not in a suspicious way, but just enough to make Tommy feel uncomfortable. He tried to focus again, shooting a few more rounds, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond just the old man's presence. The tension was palpable when it happened. "Sir!" A voice rang out from across the range. "We've got a situation." Tommy turned to see two range officers walk over to the old man, their steps quick, their voices stern. "What's going on?" Tommy asked, walking over to the side. "Hold on, kid," Sergeant Daniels barked, "and stay put." But Tommy's curiosity got the best of him. He watched as the officers began speaking to the old man, their voices sharp and accusing. Tommy couldn't hear what was being said, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was wrong. Why were they treating him like that? "Hey," Tommy said, taking a few steps toward the scene. "What's going on here?" One of the officers turned to Tommy, his face stoic but his eyes flashing with irritation. "This man's causing a disturbance. He's not authorized to be here. We need to check his ID." "Check his ID?" Tommy's voice rose without meaning to. "Are you serious? What, just because he's old?" "Stay out of this, recruit," the officer snapped. The old man, who had been silent until now, looked up at Tommy, his eyes meeting his. There was something in those eyes that Tommy hadn't seen before. Hurt, defiance, but most of all, exhaustion. "I'm not causing trouble," the old man said quietly, his voice barely rising above a murmur. "I'm just here to practice." But the officers didn't seem to hear him. They started checking the old man's pockets, rifling through his jacket as though looking for something. Tommy watched in stunned silence, his mind racing with confusion and growing anger. Why was this happening? Why was this old man being treated like a criminal? "Why are you doing this?" Tommy finally blurted out, stepping forward. "He's not doing anything wrong." The officer turned his sharp gaze on Tommy. "Stay out of this, kid. This is none of your business." But Tommy couldn't stay silent anymore. "I don't care if it's my business or not. This isn't right." In the brief, tense silence that followed, the old man's gaze shifted downward, a small sigh escaping his lips, and that's when Tommy saw it. The tattoo, a faded but unmistakable emblem across the old man's forearm, the familiar insignia of a military unit. The kind of unit Tommy knew well. The ink that told a story not many people could understand. Tommy's mouth went dry. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice faltering. You were a soldier?" The old man nodded slowly, his tired eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "That I was." The officer who had been rifling through the old man's pockets paused, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his movements. The name on the old man's ID matched the records of an elite military unit. He had served for decades in wars Tommy couldn't even begin to fathom. Tommy's heart sank. He hadn't realized what had just happened. His gut twisted as he watched the officers slowly step back, but it wasn't over yet. "Just let him go," Tommy said, voice firm. "We'll be speaking to the manager," one officer grumbled, stepping away. "You're lucky, old man." The old man remained silent as the officers walked away, their voices now muffled by the sounds of the firing range. Tommy's heart still pounded in his chest. He turned to the old man, his eyes filled with shame. I didn't know." The old man simply nodded. "Most people don't." As Tommy stood there, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over him. The old man hadn't fought back. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd just been there, as he had every right to be. "You didn't deserve that," Tommy said quietly. "I'm sorry." The old man smiled faintly, a small curve to his lips. "It's all right, son. It's not you." For a moment, Tommy wasn't sure what to say. The old man had been silent throughout the ordeal, but his calmness had shown Tommy what it meant to endure in silence, to be the one who had lived through so much, only to be faced with this, the rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. Tommy's mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. He couldn't shake the image of the old man's tattoo, the quiet defiance in his eyes, and the way the officers had treated him. He had been wrongfully accused, wrongfully mistreated, simply because of the color of his skin and the assumptions they'd made about him. As the day wound down and the firing range cleared out, Tommy walked up to the old man one last time. "I'm heading out," Tommy said. The old man looked up, his eyes still calm. "You take care, son." And Tommy walked out, the weight of what he had witnessed still heavy on his chest. He realized that the quiet moments of injustice, the ones that happened when no one was watching, when the silence weighed heavy, were the ones that left scars that couldn't be healed. Later, as Tommy sat at home reflecting on the day, he realized that this wasn't about the old man or the officers. It was about the quiet systems that allowed this kind of treatment to go unchecked. It was about the everyday actions that added up to something bigger, something that affected the community around him, the world outside, and even himself. The next day, Tommy went back to the range. This time, he saw the old man again, but this time there were no police. There was only a quiet understanding between them. Tommy made a choice that day. He wasn't just going to stay quiet. He wasn't going to let this happen again without at least trying to make a difference. Slowly, the small moments of change began, one conversation at a time, and for the old man he kept coming back, shooting, quiet, steady, and unshaken. Change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in the silence we break, in the questions we ask, and in the community we build, one small act of truth at a time. The weeks passed, and Tommy couldn't get the old man's eyes out of his mind. Every time he went back to the range, he found himself searching for the familiar figure, wondering if today would be the day he would see him again. But the truth was, Tommy didn't just want to see him. He wanted to understand, to learn more about what had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something important, something that demanded more than just quiet reflection. One Saturday morning, as the sun began to rise, Tommy pulled into the parking lot of the shooting range. The usual crowd was there, military types mostly, with a few civilians scattered about. But what caught his eye was the unmistakable presence of the old man standing near the farthest target, shooting his rounds with deliberate precision. Tommy walked over slowly, unsure of how to start. He didn't want to be too forward, but he couldn't ignore the need to say something, to acknowledge the connection that had been made, albeit silently. "Hey, Mr. Banks," Tommy called out, using the old man's name, which he had finally learned. The old man turned his head, his face breaking into a faint, knowing smile. Well, it's the kid from the other day. How you been?" Tommy shrugged, his voice tinged with a quiet hesitation. "I've been all right, but, I've been thinking about what happened that day, with the cops." Mr. Banks nodded, slowly, his hands resting on his rifle. "People forget, but you don't forget. Not once it happens to you enough. You get used to it." Tommy didn't know how to respond, so he just stood there. His gaze dropped to the ground before returning to Mr. Banks, who seemed unbothered by the silence. "Why didn't you fight back?" Tommy finally asked. "You just stood there, calm. I don't get it. If I were you, I would have lost my mind." Mr. Banks chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, son. That's the thing. People expect you to lose your cool. They want you to act out so they can call you something. But if you give them that, you just prove them right. You stay calm, you don't give them what they want. You beat them at their own game." Tommy frowned, still confused but curious. "So you just take it?" "No," Mr. Banks said, his voice growing firm. "I don't take it. But I've learned that sometimes it's not about what happens in the moment. It's about how you handle it afterward. Sometimes the only fight worth having is the one you fight in silence. And trust me, kid, that takes a hell of a lot more strength." The words hung in the air, and Tommy found himself deeply moved, though he wasn't sure why. There was a calmness to Mr. Banks that didn't just reflect an older man who had seen too much, but someone who had found a peace within himself that Tommy didn't quite understand yet. The conversation shifted then, and they talked about guns, about shooting, and about life in general. Tommy was surprised to find that he enjoyed the quiet camaraderie. He hadn't expected it to feel so natural, so easy to just sit with someone who had been through so much, who had a life that Tommy could never fully grasp. As time went on, Tommy kept returning to the range. Every time he'd find himself talking to Mr. Banks a little more, learning about the old man's life, his service, and his struggles. Mr. Banks wasn't just a former soldier. He was a man who had lived a life full of hardship, not just in combat, but in a society that still saw him through a lens of racism and judgment. Tommy, on the other hand, had grown up with privilege. He had always been the guy who fit in, the guy who didn't have to prove himself. But something was changing. The more time he spent with Mr. Banks, the more he realized just how much he had taken for granted. The ease of life he'd always known wasn't the same for everyone. The old man's experiences, his quiet strength, and his ability to hold his head high despite everything, was a lesson Tommy wasn't going to forget. It wasn't long before the incident at the range started to make waves in the community. Word had spread, as it always did, but the story didn't come out the way Tommy had expected. People in the neighborhood started to whisper, and soon enough the local news had picked up the story. Tommy had been in the background of the entire exchange, caught on the security footage talking to the officer, trying to stand up for Mr. Banks. At first, the response was mixed. Some people rallied around the old man, voicing their anger about the way he had been treated. Others, however, remained silent, unwilling to take a stand. It was as if the truth was right there in front of them, but still some refused to acknowledge it. The apathy stung Tommy more than he cared to admit. Still, Mr. Banks remained unbothered by the growing attention. He continued to visit the range, keeping to himself. But Tommy began to see a shift in the way people treated him. They noticed him more now, they talked to him more. And slowly the neighborhood began to change, if only in small, quiet ways. At the next community meeting, Tommy didn't want to be the center of attention. But when the conversation turned to the incident at the range, he found himself standing. "I just want to say something," Tommy said, his voice calm but resolute. "What happened to Mr. Banks shouldn't have happened, but I think the bigger issue isn't just the cops or the range, it's us. We let things like this happen every day and we don't even realize it. It's not always the loudest voices that make the most impact. Sometimes it's the quiet moments of injustice that go unnoticed. We can't let that be okay anymore. We have to start speaking up, even if it's uncomfortable." The room fell, silent. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded, acknowledging the truth in Tommy's words. No one cheered, no one stood up and applauded. But something had shifted, even if it was small. The conversation had begun. Tommy's voice had found its place in the community, but it wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. Weeks later, the neighborhood association announced a small but significant change, a community program to address issues of discrimination and bias. The initiative was quiet at first, but it was a start. And for Tommy, that was enough. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset with a cup of coffee in his hands, he saw Mr. Banks across the street, standing in his front yard. He waved, and the old man waved back. Things had changed. Not in a big, dramatic way, but in a real way. Tommy had found his voice, and for the first time it felt like it was making a difference. The world wasn't going to change overnight. But that didn't mean small changes didn't matter. As Tommy looked at the horizon, he realized something profound. Sometimes the quietest actions had the most lasting impact, and for once, that thought gave him hope. The weeks that followed were a slow, steady unraveling of the walls that had once kept the community isolated from the quiet injustices that had always festered beneath the surface. Tommy's voice had ignited a shift, but the real work was just beginning. The community meetings continued, and as word spread, more people started showing up. They were a mix of old neighbors who had lived in the area for decades, newcomers who hadn't yet felt the weight of systemic bias, and young people eager to find their place in a changing world. Tommy didn't expect the discussions to change overnight, but there was something about the collective discomfort that felt like progress. Each week they talked about what had happened at the range, dissecting it from different angles. Some were skeptical, others angry, and a few were visibly moved by the stories of people who had dealt with racial profiling for years, long before the incident at the range had brought it into the light. Tommy learned more about Mr. Banks with each passing day, and he began to see the old man not as an emblem of injustice, but as a symbol of resilience. Mr. Banks never asked for attention, never tried to make his story more dramatic than it needed to be. He simply lived it, and in doing so he taught those around him what it meant to quietly resist, not through grand gestures, but through dignity, through the simple act of continuing on despite the odds. One evening, as Tommy sat in his kitchen, flipping through old newspaper clippings about the incident at the range, he realized just how much things had changed. It wasn't the headlines or the fleeting moments of public outrage that made the difference. It was the conversations in the parking lots, the discussions over coffee, and the growing acknowledgement that systemic bias wasn't just a problem for a few people, but for all of them. It was in those small moments that the real power of change lay. One afternoon, Mr. Banks showed up at Tommy's doorstep, a rare event. Tommy hadn't expected it, but when he opened the door, the old man stood there, holding a small, neatly wrapped box. "Got something for you, kid," Mr. Banks said, with a rare smile. Tommy took the box, confused. "For me? What's this?" The old man shrugged. "Just a little something. Open it." Tommy unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden plaque. It wasn't big, but it had a weight to it, the kind of weight that felt substantial, even though it was simple. On the plaque in bold letters was the word strength. Tommy stared at it for a moment, confused. "It's not just a word," Mr. Banks said softly, his voice steady. "It's a reminder. Every time you look at it, remember what it means to stand tall, to keep your head up even when they try to tear you down. That's the kind of strength you'll need to keep going." Tommy's eyes flickered to the old man, and for the first time, he saw something that wasn't just quiet resolve. It was pride. The kind of pride that came not from doing what was easy, but from doing what was necessary. "You don't have to thank me," Mr. Banks added, looking away. "Just take it and keep moving forward. You've got it in you." The words lingered in the air long after Mr. Banks had left. Tommy felt the weight of them settle deep inside him, a quiet understanding that he wasn't just fighting for someone else, he was fighting for himself too, for a future that didn't just repeat the mistakes of the past, but for one that was actively trying to rebuild and change. The following month, Tommy was invited to speak at a town hall meeting, an event that had been organized by a group of local high school students who were passionate about social justice. It wasn't something Tommy had ever imagined himself doing, but when the students reached out, he couldn't refuse. They wanted him to talk about the incident, about what had happened at the range, and how they could make a difference in their community. That night, as he stood in front of a room full of strangers, young faces, some older, all expectant, Tommy found himself fighting the familiar knot in his stomach. But he couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened, not after everything that had been said and unsaid. "I'm not here to tell you a story of triumph," Tommy began, his voice steady. "I'm here to tell you that the story is still being written. What happened at the range wasn't a one-off incident. It's a reflection of a larger problem. It's a story that's been playing out in our communities for years." The crowd fell silent as Tommy spoke, his words resonating deeply within the walls of the small community center. "But the thing is," he continued, "we have the power to change that. We can't change what happened in the past. We can't change what anyone said or did to us. But we can change what happens next. We can speak up. We can show up for each other. And most importantly, we can support those who have been silenced for far too long." As Tommy spoke, he felt a change in the air. The weight of everything that had happened, the officers, the old man, the anger, the guilt, began to lift. He wasn't sure if it was because he was finally speaking out, or because the community was finally ready to listen. But either way, something had shifted. And it was no longer just about him or Mr. Banks. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed aside, ignored, or silenced. As the meeting ended, people lingered, talking in small groups. Some came up to Tommy, thanking him for his words. Others nodded quietly, their faces thoughtful. But there was one thing they all shared, a sense of purpose, however small, that things could get better. That night, as Tommy sat back in his chair at home, the plaque Mr. Banks had given him sat on, his desk right next to the family photos. The word strength stared back at him, a reminder that the quiet battles, the ones fought with dignity, not anger, were the ones that mattered most. Tommy didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, no matter what, he was going to keep moving forward. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, he'd inspire someone else to do the same. The story didn't end in one speech or one meeting. It continued with every decision made in the quiet moments, with every act of standing tall, even when it was easier to look away. The change, Tommy realized, wasn't just about the public. battles, but about the small personal shifts that took root within a community. And slowly the world changed, not in grand gestures, but in quiet acts of courage and resilience. As Tommy sat there, looking out the window at the quiet street outside, he knew the fight was far from over. But it didn't have to be a fight for justice alone. It could be a fight for understanding, for compassion, for listening to the voices that had been silenced for too long. And as long as he was breathing, Tommy would keep fighting, for himself, for Mr. Banks, and for the community that had begun to listen. The months that followed were full of the kind of change that didn't happen in a flash, but like a slow, growing tide. It was undeniable. Tommy kept his head down and kept moving forward, though the weight of what had happened at the range lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't just the cops or the officers or the accusations that had been made. It was the way people in the neighborhood started to look at him differently, not in a bad way, but with the quiet understanding that something had shifted. The town's attitude was different, and so was Tommy. There was an unspoken change in the way people treated one another, and the small, almost imperceptible shifts added up to something bigger. Tommy and Mr. Banks spent more time together, not in long conversations but in shared silence. They met often at the range, each of them keeping to their own rhythm, but every once in a while they'd exchange a knowing glance, a nod, a word, and there was a sense of respect that ran deeper than anything Tommy had ever known. One afternoon, as Tommy was getting ready to leave the range, he noticed something different. Mr. Banks was talking to a few young kids who had just started showing up to the range, eager to learn about guns and responsibility. Tommy couldn't hear their conversation, but the older man's gestures were calm, his tone warm but firm. He was teaching them, not just about shooting, but about respect. Respect for the weapon, for the people around you, for yourself as... Tommy walked toward them. He felt an odd feeling of pride swell in his chest. Mr. Banks had turned the page, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And Tommy realized, not for the first time, that he wasn't the same person who had first stepped into the range months ago. He had changed too. He was no longer the quiet observer. He had found his voice, and in doing so had started a ripple that wasn't going to stop any time soon. "Hey, Mr. Banks," Tommy called, his voice light but filled with affection. Mr. Banks looked up, the corners of his lips lifting slightly. "You here to shoot or teach, kid?" Tommy chuckled, walking up to the older man. "Maybe a little bit of both. You seem to be getting a crowd around here. Just giving them the basics," Mr. Banks said, motioning to the kids who were listening intently. "Sometimes that's all you need, the basics. Teach 'em right and they'll go far." Tommy stood there watching the kids. A part of him, the one that had first felt uneasy about the old man, was grateful for what Mr. Banks had done for him. And now for these kids. "You ever think about telling your story?" Tommy asked quietly, glancing at Mr. Banks. The old man's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. "Nah, some stories don't need to be told, kid. You live 'em. That's enough." Tommy nodded. He understood that now. Not every battle needed to be fought in the spotlight. Sometimes it was the quiet victories that mattered the most. A few days later, Tommy found himself sitting in a small community meeting, surrounded by familiar faces. The group wasn't large, but it had grown. The voices that had once been passive, hesitant, were now filled with conviction. They were no longer just reacting to what had happened, but actively trying to build a better community. Tommy stood up at the front, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was different. There was no fear, no hesitation. "I've been asked a lot about what happened with Mr. Banks and the cops," Tommy began, his voice steady. "The truth is, that day was just one example of a larger problem. We all saw it, we all felt it, and some of us chose to speak out, while others stayed quiet." He paused, letting his words settle in the room. Everyone was listening now, really listening, But what matters is what we do next, Tommy continued. This isn't just about that one day. It's about how we treat each other every day. It's about the quiet things that happen when no one's looking. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The room was silent. For a moment, Tommy thought he had lost them, but then a hand went up in the back of the room. "You're right," a neighbor, Mrs. Fraser, said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. It's about doing better for the next generation." Tommy smiled and nodded. "Exactly, it's about us. It's about our community. We don't have to wait for someone else to change. We can do it right here, right now." The meeting wrapped up with discussions about local initiatives. They talked about starting an awareness campaign, a mentoring program for the kids, and a small support network for those who had experienced discrimination. Nothing was huge or dramatic, but it was something. It was progress. As the group began to disband, Tommy stood off to the side, looking around the room. There were people here now who were willing to stand up, to speak out, and to make a change. Outside, he saw Mr. Banks standing by his car, looking up at the sky. Tommy walked over to him, and for the first time there was no tension between them, just a quiet camaraderie. "You know," Tommy said, glancing at the old man, "I think things are starting to change around here." Mr. Banks turned to him, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, but it's going to take time. Change always does. But it starts with people like you." Tommy shook his head, a quiet laugh escaping him. "Nah, man, it's not just me, it's all of us. We just had to get started." Mr. Banks raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Maybe. But you made the first move. That counts for something." Tommy didn't know if he believed that completely, but as they stood there in the fading light, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The old man had taught him so much, but it wasn't just about standing up to the wrongs of the world. It was about choosing to be part of the solution, even when it seemed like the fight was too big. As the neighborhood slowly, quietly began to change, Tommy knew this. The fight wasn't over, but it didn't have to be won in a single day. It could be won in the spaces between, in the conversations, the small victories, and the moments when people simply chose to do better. And that, Tommy thought, was enough. As he and Mr. Banks stood there side by side, Tommy knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the quiet strength that only time, dignity, and resilience could build. And that was where true change began.